What is game media? A more traditional approach to game studies might begin with a definition of what games are. This typically involves a series of logical steps detailing what counts as a game and what doesn't. But that is not what this subject is about. We are not only interested in games as objects, but also the ecosystem or media ecology which exists because of games. And so our focus for the subject is the broader topic of game media. We will be discussing specific games and their design principles, but this will be framed within broader thinking of theories and ideas about audiences, about communities related to games, about topical issues like the intellectual property involved in games and game texts. We'll be thinking about the way in which games and game media represent, and we'll be talking about games in terms of their contribution to knowledge production, and so on. The important thing to think is that game media is an umbrella term. It's a really encompassing description of diverse and multiple elements that are part of the games industry's current global success. So when we talk about game media, we're talking about the hardware layer. We're talking about the physical and the material components of playing video games and computer games and board games. So we're talking about the material objects. We're talking about the consoles, the computers, the controllers, the chips, the mobile phones, even the internet servers and the cloud storage that enables digital distribution and social interaction through multiplayer online. When we talk about game media, we're also talking about the software layer. So we're talking about the apps, the code, the platforms, and the programs which operate to provide players with game experiences. So, obviously then, game media also refers to the content layer, the games themselves, the presence of visual and sound design, the character and level design, as well as, of course, the embedded narrative and world building that shapes and enhances the player's experience. Game media also involves a promotional layer, which encircles the hardware and the software layers. It encircles and is kind of part of the content layer. And this includes everything from advertising, merchandising, marketing, journalism, criticism, and review, which all support the consumer's experience and their understanding and awareness of the current state of the industry and its products. This brings us to another important layer, which of course is the cultural layer. This is the production of blogs, wikis, online videos, Facebook groups, podcasts, YouTube videos, Twitch streams, and of course the massive amount of social media discussion that happens on Discord servers, on Steam reviews. And this is part of what we will talk in depth in this subject of the part of the participatory media and the participatory culture that is part of the contemporary experience of games that everyone, even casual players, experience by playing games at any level. So one of the primary goals of the subject is to teach you how to research and analyze games media with specific attention to the industrial modes of production, distribution, and reception, and to recognize that these are not discrete but overlapping categories. The industry particularly the games media industry, does not simply refer to the manufacture of hardware or the production of games. When we talk about the games media industry, what we're actually referring to is a creative industry. I'm going to unpack what that term creative industry means in a second. But first, I think it's important that we dig into the idea of what an industry is and where does that history come to us from. So you've probably heard of the notion of Fordism. So the word industry is typically associated with mass production, mass labour, and the principles of Fordism. Henry Ford was an American industrialist who founded the Ford Motor Company, one of hundreds of small automotive producers operating at the start of the 20th century. Ford did not invent or create the production line. Rather, he saw its potential and he used it to transform the automobile, the car, from a rare luxury good into a mass-produced commodity. He made the car reasonably, at least much more than it was, affordable. He turned the automobile into the car, a personal transport convenience which fundamentally changed the world. Other industries existed, of course, prior to this innovation, because the core production of goods and services was fundamental to the organising principles of society that emerged out of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. It was Fordism, however, these principles of mass production, that epitomised manufacturing by standardising parts, by decreasing assembly costs, and reducing the role of individuals and experts in the production of goods. A factory line meant that you could replace individual workers and you wouldn't lose the knowledge invested in those workers. Of course, this is a very dehumanizing and despecializing phenomena, but it's an important one to recognize that is at the center of what we think of as being industry. So manufacturing became the most important industry in the globe in the 20th century, building on the coal, the steel, and the agricultural industries, and having this major effect of reducing the costs of consumer goods. The affordability of cheaply produced goods became synonymous with lower wages, but also a linear production chain. The creative industries is an important term because this system of mass production and standardization was adopted universally. It was applied to publishing. It was applied to music and television and film and radio and marketing and advertising and sports and the performing arts and other cultural works that contribute to the economy. Together, this combination of creativity and industrial production became known as the creative industries. The creative industries now include a really broad range of activities which contribute to local, national, and global economic progress through the commercialization of knowledge, information, and obviously expression or creativity. In his book, The Rise of the Creative Class and How It's Transforming Work, Leisure, and Everyday Life, Richard Florida in 2002 observed that the creative industries have become part of the process of shifting from material production to knowledge production. This, of course, was made possible by the information era, particularly the post-1995 internet era. And Florida argued that because of these technological breakthroughs, human creativity really became the ultimate economic resource. And it became clear over the past 2 decades that creativity, innovation, knowledge, and imagination are going to be the major contributors to the global economy of the 21st century and beyond. There's an interesting definition of the creative industries provided by the Queensland University of Technology, QUT, and they describe the creative industries as innovation-led, knowledge-intensive, and highly exportable. This is a really interesting kind of definition or set of concepts that belong to how you might understand the creative industries and whether you're thinking, okay, what is a creative industry and what isn't. A creative industry demonstrates these elements. QUT also argues that the creative industries contribute to cultural diversity, social inclusion, environmental sustainability and technological advancements. And so you can see some of the underlying politics involved in this term, which are also quite interesting. So let's narrow our focus now and start to think about games as a global industry. And I'm not going to just talk about games, because I think it's important to talk rather about games media. So we're not just talking about the individual game itself, but we're talking about the enormous industry, the game media industry that fits under that umbrella that we were talking about before. So games media is one of the largest contributors to the creative industries globally. There are major national centers of production, of course, in America, in Japan, Korea, China, UK, and across Europe, but also in smaller countries like Australia and New Zealand. We do, a reasonably big trade in game media production. This means that game media has been a major driver of globalization, not in just hardware terms, right? Because most of our hardware is produced in China and Korea and distributed around the world. But in terms of what we might think of as intercultural flow between the West and the East, particularly between Japan and the US from the 1980s onward. And we'll talk more about that in lectures in the future. The global games media industry is an enormous power engine of capitalism, with China rapidly becoming the most profitable market, specifically in the mobile sector. Here, we can see, kind of comparison to the movie industry, which is probably the other large historical cultural media industry that's useful to compare games against. So Variety.com reports in 2018 a record-breaking year for box office revenues in the movie industry, with $41 billion in global ticket sales. Now that's just ticket sales alone. So that's not taking into account DVD. Streaming services. That's just pure tickets. So, but let's put that in comparison to the IBIS World figures from the global movie industry home entertainment revenue. So all of the kind of ways to consume home entertainment. So that's including crossover into Netflix and television and things like that, cable. In its entirety, the global movie industry home entertainment revenue, according to IBIS World, in 2018 was approximately $136 billion. I'm not sure exactly how reliable these figures are, but it gives us a good kind of marker to think about contextually. Comparatively, the Games Industry Biz study, they put the games industry worth $135 billion in 2018, with revenues growing by over 10%. The mobile games industry, just the mobile sale, so you're looking at mobile apps, you're looking at microtransactions in mobile apps, that kind of thing. Games Industry Biz are putting the mobile games industry revenue at about $63 billion. So that's almost half of the total profit from the games industry just in mobile games. If we dig into the figures, mobile games account for the bulk of the industry's revenue, 47%, worth $63 billion. And that was up 12.8% year on year. So these figures will be much higher this year and probably much higher at the time you're listening. Smartphones, of course, are leading the way with revenues of up to $50 billion, while tablets, interestingly, account for $11.4 billion. Now, these are global figures, estimates largely in US dollars. So I think that tablet figure is very cool because, that's really pointing to a sector of the audience for games that aren't even accessing it on their mobile phones. I'm talking about children here, I think. Tablet games account for 10% of the overall market, meaning that 1 out of every $10 spent on games is spent on tablets, which is pretty amazing. For those of you that are gamers, you'll probably, when we talk about games, think about consoles and PCs as being the kind of top-end consumer point of games. And these figures show that's just not true. Mobile gaming clearly dominates. But the console industry has been growing. In 2018, it increased 15.2%, and its annual profit is somewhere around 38 to 40 US billion per year, possibly even higher now. The PC games market, this involves both desktop and laptop devices. This accounts for around 25%, so 1/4 of the global games market. That's pretty important. 1 in every $4 spent on video games is spent for the PC. Now, this also includes download games, box games, but also browser games, and that's still a thing. Facebook games is still a major contributor to the industry, and we know from studies that it's largely women playing games on Facebook and largely middle to late age women. Revenues are also up for the PC games industries, and they have been growing for the better part of the decade. Games revenue, particularly in the mobile sector, is not just pure sales of games, but includes a huge amount of virtual commodities, power-ups, unlocks, extra content, weapon and character skins. These are just some of the massive market of virtual commodities that are part of the creative components of the games industry. These are often called microtransactions, and I really think that's a bad term. We should just be thinking about them in terms of transactions. These are purchases, they are objects being purchased, and they're not micro, right? They're massive. The numbers here are enormous. And whether it costs 25 cents for a loot crate, or $1 for a skin, or $10 for a DLC pack, or whatever, these are not microtransactions. These are sales. They're also hugely important to the games industry and its investors, and attention and scrutiny to them have increased recently as governments and public institutions begin to really take the games media industry seriously and start to regulate it as they have regulated other types of entertainment creative industries. Historically, it's important to think about games and where they sit in relation to other media. The dominant media of the 19th century was clearly the novel, the written word. The dominant media of the 20th century was clearly started out as film and probably started out as radio, to be honest, and then film and television. And television is still up there, but I think predicting ahead, the dominant media of the 21st century is going to be video games, and I'm taking this kind of observation from Dyson and Saussures' History of Video Games in 64 Objects, which is a great book. So let's think about how games get made for a minute, and the kind of operation of the industry, and how it's transformed over the last 2 decades. We're going to look at the historical development of the studio system over the next couple of lectures, and we're going to look at how the industry has developed, and from the 60s and 70s, the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. So this is just a really quick, brief overview to situate you in thinking about the industry going forward. Video games inherited the studio production system from radio, film, and television. And this means that at the start of this linear production model, you get developers working in a studio. So video game development just basically has been dominated by the studio system. It replicated the film, television, publication system. This is the same as software creation, and many other creative industries are kind of caught in this model. And it's thought of as a linear industrial production model, moving from creators at one end to consumers at the other. And of course, if you know anything about the internet, you know that this linear model has been totally disrupted by the rise of consumer power and the changes that the internet has brought. But still, we've got this legacy system that we're dealing with, and part of that system is, of course, publishers. Many studios are actually owned by video game publishers, like Electronic Arts or Activision Blizzard, and many studios, developers have specific relationships with publishers who fund the development process. This, of course, is complicated by hardware manufacturers. So some hardware manufacturers also operate like publishers and developers, or have publishing companies or publishing arms and in-house development studios. I'm thinking particularly here Nintendo, but there are different iterations with regards to Sony and Microsoft. That then brings us to the distributors. And for the most part of the history of video games, distribution was physical. This meant that publishers have complicated relationships with distributors and retail outlets, what we might call the bricks and mortar stores. For example, in the US, the retail chain Walmart has enormous power in the video games market because they can control what is sold on their shelves across that country. The biggest change for the industry in the last 2 decades has been the rise of digital distribution. So the elimination of the physical component of the sales of video games. Some companies still retain this. I mean, it's interesting to see, even with the latest generation of Nintendo and the Nintendo Switch, you're still working on a cartridge system. And of course, that's clearly, designed to try and combat intellectual property theft and piracy. But at the same time, the availability of affordable digital downloads has reduced piracy in the video games industry. It hasn't eliminated it, but it's definitely reduced it, because it's made games more accessible and more affordable. And of course, mobile app stores, right, which are basically digital game stores. But we're still in this hybrid situation. We haven't eliminated bricks and mortar entirely. This brings us, of course, to the role of advertisers and marketing. You cannot underestimate just how much money is spent on advertising and marketing in the video game industry. It's an important and it's a powerful creative industry in itself, but also in the way that it contributes to how non-gamers and casual players come to an understanding of game media. I noticed it a few years back, but I was in Melbourne at the time, and I was just taken by the number of large AAA titles, which are the kind of the big games, and their advertising on buses, and billboards. There was definitely a change a few years ago where we saw a massive increase in the spending on physical media for game advertising. Then, at the end of this historical linear production model, are players. And players are often underestimated in this system. I will talk in the future about how digital distribution has changed this. And once players were simply thought of as the endpoint, the consumer. And all that mattered was the number of consumers. And so players themselves and players' investment and player communities were often disregarded. But digital distribution, particularly Steam, changed that dramatically. that also had flow-on effects because players began to create content on YouTube, on Twitch, on Facebook, blogs, podcasts, you name it, right? There is an enormous degree of player communities who produce content. Now that feeds back into the system as promotional material. Similarly, we have the rise of independent game designers who are empowered by players, whether it's through Kickstarter or the Greenlight system on Steam when it first emerged. But we get what's called independent game designers who are not funded by the publishers, but instead funded directly by the players themselves. This creates a huge amount of non-linearity in the system. The internet shifted the conditions of this global creative industry, introducing non-linearity and direct audience feedback into the production chain. Steam meant that you could start publishing games before they were finished and you could get feedback from your players. Right? That is just an incredible development. So that totally changes the notion of what a product in this game media industry even is. Indies and developers can then also bypass publishers and bypass the physical stores and publish their games and distribute their games via Steam. And we're increasingly seeing diversity in the marketplace with other online stores like the Epic Store, Uplay. There's a whole range of them. And so this has a massive shift again on this this industry. Now, because we see indies and we see independent developers working with players and their involvement in the promotional material and the cultural production then start to be able to direct attention towards developers who are working within the traditional studio system. We see, you're able to tweet directly or contact on Facebook or, organize petitions and provide feedback via Reddit and things like that plug directly into the main production chain. Similarly, we are, seeing players having organized feedback to publishers. Right, one of the main things that we've seen recently in recent years is players pushing back against companies like EA and pushing back against predatory consumer practices. So that's a really big summary of kind of the major changes that the industry has gone through, over the past 40 years, and we're going to break that down much further over the course of this subject and talk about it in more detail. Thanks for playing.